Welcome, everyone. I updated my manual matchmaking guide for private matches and decided to put it in video form this time around. If you have been interested in hosting your own private PvP matches but weren't sure how to best split the teams, this is the video for you. I will also link the script for this video in the video description for anyone who would rather have a written version of this guide. Now onto the guide. Generally, you'll get the best results when paying attention to the following variables. Number 1 is player tankiness and survivability. For matchmaking, this refers to the number of tanky players you can place on each team. Ideally, you can afford to put the same number of tanky players on both teams. Usually doing so results in a better fight quality. You also need to be careful about adding a healer onto your team that already has a lot of tanky players on it. Ideally, you'd put the healer on the team with more squishy, inexperienced players on it. Sometimes you do need to deliberately create a team that is stacked with more tanky players than the opposing team. A good example is when you are trying to balance out a particularly strong player and you don't have a better option. Having too many tanky players with low damage inside the match can result in really boring stalemates and also puts a lot of strain on the few squishy DPS players inside the match. Focus killing enemies is supposed to be a team job, and if all of it gets left in the hands of only one player, that team will struggle to kill enough and will lose effectiveness. They will hold the nodes really well, but will struggle to regain any nodes they lose, especially if they don't have much movement speed. Likewise, pitting too many squishy players against a really tanky team, especially a really tanky team that also does a lot of damage, can result in the squishy team being unable to counterplay at all while also dying like flies. This tends to be more true of inexperienced or under-geared teams, though. Number 2 is player damage output. Generally, this is covered by the stuff I put in the matchmaking by class composition section, and the Know Your Players section, which are located further into this guide. Number 3, we have Know Your Players. Ideally, you have worked with all of the players you are trying to matchmake before. You'd want to have a general understanding of how experienced they are and what kind of build they have. If you are trying to split two players that play the same class, for example, and one of them is playing a tanky build and is more experienced, and the other is playing a really squishy build and isn't as experienced, this can significantly unbalance the teams. You also want to split up the experienced players evenly when possible. Individuals matter. Sometimes an individual player will be different enough that you need to do something you normally wouldn't do in order to successfully matchmake them. Ideally, try to split the number of undergeared, underperforming players evenly across both teams. If one team has only one super weak player and the other team has 3 super weak players, that team with the 3 super weak players will probably lose hard. Number 4 is split the class duplicates. Try to split each class evenly across the teams whenever possible, especially if it is one of the strongest classes at winning matches. Never permit more than 4 of the same class to be in the same match. While it may technically be possible to matchmake a team with 3+ copies of the same class, the fight quality is usually awful and not worth it. Number 5 is matchmaking by class compositions. As a disclaimer, this section was written using information from Module 21 and Module 22. Some class combinations and classes are much stronger than others, and player skill experience isn't always enough to overcome this. Here is more information on how to matchmake classes for matches. Healers. A healer is a huge advantage, especially a cleric healer. A really skilled, really mobile healer, or an experienced, smartly built healer. Generally, you want them to be on the team that has more squishy and underperforming players on it when trying to balance them. You can also matchmake one healer against one wizard if you only have one of each of these things in the match. Moving on to wizards. Wizards are also a huge advantage. So much so that you can actually put a wizard on one team and a healer on the opposite team in some cases to successfully balance the teams. This assumes you only have one healer and one wizard in the match. Wizards can also be matchmaked against a matching number of similarly built wizards. A strong wizard can also be matchmaked against a strong fighter or a skilled ranger. 2 wizards per team is balanced, but will significantly lower the match quality for there to be this many wizards inside a match. Fighters. Fighters are a huge advantage, albeit they aren't as essential as wizards are. A strong fighter can be matched against a strong wizard or a skilled ranger. And of course, you can also matchmake a fighter against another fighter. 2 fighters per team is balanced, but it will significantly lower the match quality for there to be this many fighters inside a match. Bard. Bard is a huge advantage, albeit not as OP as fighter or wizard are. Bard is the only buff-debuff class, and they combined particularly well with one strong DPS player at a time. They make it so that any strong DPS teammate they pair up with can shred through normally really tanky enemies like paper. Their presence also makes it a lot harder, if not impossible, to kill the person they are paired with. The Bard itself is usually really hard to kill as well, but they can be sensitive to enemy interrupts, and some really good Bard builds are really fragile. In general, avoid putting a Bard on the same team as the only healer in the match. Also be careful about pairing them up with the most skilled, powerful DPS player in the match. Ranger and DPS Cleric. Ranger and DPS Cleric are mostly interchangeable with each other in matches. They deal ranged, really high damage that is highly desirable in team fights. In general, you should avoid placing a DPS Cleric on the same team as a Ranger whenever possible. It usually results in the team having way too much damage. If you have to put these two classes together, then try to mismatch their experience levels. Both of these classes pair really well with Fighter, so be watchful of that too. It is to be noted that there are still some significant differences between these two classes that can come into play. Ranger has a lot of CCs and Cleric has almost no CCs. Ranger tends to be squishy, and DPS Cleric tends to be tanky. Barbarian and Rogue. Barbarian and Rogue are mostly interchangeable with each other in matches. They are the best at helping their team finish off low health enemies and securing the kill for their team. If you had one Barbarian and one Rogue in the match, you would want to split them evenly across the teams as though they were the same class. There are still some small differences between them you do need to pay attention to, though. Rogue is generally squishier than Barbarian, but has much stronger crowd control because of Smoke Bomb. Barbarian is generally tankier than Rogue, but has less crowd control. Warlock. Warlock rotates faster than anything else, but its damage can often feel a bit blunt or underwhelming on teams. This probably wouldn't be an issue for a maxed out meta DPS build played aggressively, though. They are generally tanky as well. They hard counter Rogue, and they also hard counter Ranger if the Warlock is good. In general, be careful about combining a tanky Warlock with two other players that are tanky and can keep up the pressure on enemies with high damage. For example, combining a Warlock with two other things like Fighter, DPS Cleric, Wizard. Such a combo can result in melting squishy teams in seconds. Paladin. Paladin tends to be the least effective class. Generally, you matchmake them according to what they do. When you see a well-geared, properly built PvP Paladin, it's going to be one of the three following things. So tanky it might as well be immortal. A really slow-moving healer that is also nearly immortal. A squishy DPS build that doesn't do as much DPS as actual DPS classes. Notably, the PvP map you are on can significantly affect which classes are the strongest. This can throw off matchmaking if you are attempting to matchmake for a map you aren't as familiar with. One example is trying to matchmake for the Gauntlgrim map. Whisper Knife Rogues and DPS Barbarians do better on the Gauntlgrim map than they do on the Domination maps. A second example are fighters on the Hotenow and Rivenscar maps. Fighters tend to excel on tightly packed maps such as these two. This is also true for wizards and rangers. Slow-moving classes such as paladins also have an easier time on this map due to the shorter travel distance. A third example are warlocks and rogues on the Stardock map. These two classes have an advantage on this map. Ranger can also be advantaged on Stardock, provided they play in a specific way. Rangers need to kill enemies in between nodes really often in order to excel on Stardock. Six is matchmaking by crowd control. The previous section on classes mentions more about this, but in general, something with a lot of crowd control has the upper hand against something that doesn't have much crowd control. You want to split the amount of crowd control both teams have evenly when possible. Here are some other miscellaneous matchmaking notes. When attempting manual matchmaking, there are a lot of possible situations and variables that can give you unexpected results. Even the best players this game ever had that did thousands of pre-mades didn't get matchmaking right 100% of the time. Sometimes there is a conflict in match score balance versus match quality. Here are some examples of what I mean by this. Sometimes in order to get a match to come out balanced, you'd need to create a comp that wouldn't necessarily provide the most pleasant fighting experience, or are particularly rough on certain players. Likewise, some matches end with a big point difference between the two teams, but could still last a while and have a surprisingly high fight quality. Sometimes you successfully balance the power and amount of experience of the players in a match really well, but one team plays uncharacteristically badly. This can cause matches that could have gone either way to appear unbalanced. Player motivation is a big part of this. Usually you need your players to either be at a Usually you need your players to either be at a specified bare minimum item level or above that number in order for it to be possible to balance the teams. The exception is if you have an even number of players at around the same super low item level as each other that you can split. In Mod 21, this item level was 29k plus for DPS players, and around 18k plus for just Paladin and Cleric healers. In Mod 22, item levels got bigger, and I don't know what the new minimum required item level is for matchmaking. That is everything, guys. See you next time.